Which teaching methods work best? It comes as a surprise to most teachers to discover that the methods they use are not the ones that research says are best. Without thinking, many teachers tend to stick to tradition and teach the way that they were taught. But there has been progress in education, as in much else, and much better methods have been devised. So this series of videos argues, let us see which methods research recommends and try these methods out in our own teaching. This should lead to big improvements in students' learning, so you will make big differences to the life chances of your students. I describe lots of evidence-based teaching methods in this series of videos and in my books. The methods are useful for all teachers of all subjects with learners of any age, though some won't work for very young learners. You will need to adapt them for your own situation. They work in face-to-face teaching, of course, but can easily be adapted to teaching online or teaching remotely. To summarise this lesson in advance, I will ask, what evidence is there on the effectiveness of different teaching methods? Why do effective teaching methods work so well? And we'll look at note-making, as I've said, as an example. And we'll see why it works. There'll be a quiz at the end of this video, so listen carefully. A useful way to evaluate the effectiveness of a teaching method is the process used to trial drugs. It's called a randomized control trial. There have been tens of thousands of these in education. What are they? How do they work? Suppose a researcher wanted to know whether getting students to write their own notes was an effective teaching method, more effective than the teacher giving the students teacher-written notes. The teacher could use two classes being taught the same material by the same teacher, and this teacher would have to be experienced and capable to be in this research. The classes would need to be as identical as possible in terms of the mix of ability in the class and so on. Random assignment of the students to the two classes would be one way of achieving this. The researcher, let's say, asks the teacher what they normally do to ensure that their students get notes. Let's say the teacher replies, I give my students handouts that I've written carefully over many years to summarize the topic that I've just taught. The researcher would say, okay, please do exactly that with the control group. Now, the control group is just there for the sake of comparison with the experimental group, as we'll see. The researcher then instructs the teacher in how to get the students in their experimental group to write their own notes. This group does not get the teacher's notes. So the only difference between the two groups is that the control group gets the teacher's notes as normal, and the experimental group must write their own notes. Everything else is kept the same for both groups. Later, the researcher will test to see if the experimental group learns better than the control, as we will see. The way the teacher uses note-making is as follows. First, students are warned that they will be writing their own notes on the topic that the teacher is about to present. The teacher presents this new material for, say, 10 minutes. The teacher puts a few key words and phrases on the board while he or she teaches, and perhaps gives students headings for sections of the notes. Immediately after this, the students are asked to write their own notes, leaving gaps between paragraphs and some space on the page for future additions. They use the teacher's headings if these were given. The teacher is quiet during this. Students now check each other's notes, suggesting improvements. Now comes a teacher check. The teacher asks a few students to read a part of what they have written. The teacher then says thank you and asks the class, is that right? Is there anything Alice has missed out? Other students can then make suggestions. Then another student reads a sample of their notes and the questioning repeats. In this way, the teacher can determine what students have written and what was missing. Students correct and add to their notes during this class discussion using the space they left on the pages. When the teacher and the class are well practiced at this note-making, the researcher will begin a trial. Both the control group and the experimental group are taught the same topic in the same way apart from the note-making. Then both groups are given the same test on this topic. Here is a typical graph of the results of this test for the control group. This is a good teacher using their usual approach of giving students teacher-written handouts. The number of students with a given mark is shown on the vertical axis. Some students do very well, some badly, but most get an average mark. Researchers find that the experimental group do much better than the control in a note-making experiment like this. The average mark of the experimental group, shown in blue, is about 70%, but the average for the control group is less than 50%. The improvement in average marks is expressed in a measure called the effect size. It's the size of the effect of note-making. This experiment is then repeated many times with different teachers and different researchers in other institutions with other subjects and with students of different ages. Then a senior researcher will collect all of the studies on note-making of high quality to summarize the findings and combine the data statistically to find the average effect size. The senior researcher then writes what is called a research review or a meta-study, which critically reviews what the studies show in a very fair and systematic way, and he might suggest new experiments. The average effect size of note-making is much higher than for most teaching methods. Before we say more about effect sizes, though, let's consider a puzzle. The control group has good notes. They were written by the teacher and have been improved over the teacher's career. But the experimental group has poor notes. When I used this method myself, I noticed that student-written notes are usually incomplete, poorly explained, and even after the various checks. So why does the group with poorest notes do best in the test? Please answer this question. Have a think. Pause the video, please, to give yourself time. Cognitive scientists have tried to describe the conditions for good learning. Let's use their work to look at this student note-making experiment. Here are some very general cognitive science findings. 1. We learn and remember what we have thought hard about. Just hearing a fact from a teacher does not create good learning and memory. Thinking hard about it does. 2, we understand new things by connecting new learning to old learning. A dictionary explains new concepts by explaining it in terms of concepts you already understand. New learning needs to be linked to old learning in a similar way. Students create their own meanings. They don't just remember yours. The next video explains this more, but a student creates their own version of what you have taught. They don't just remember your words like a tape recorder. 4, students' meanings need to be checked and corrected. Students' understandings will inevitably contain errors and omissions. These need to be corrected as soon as possible, so we need to check and correct the student's version of what you taught. Number 5, learning needs to be reused about 6 times to be remembered well. More on this in a later video, but reuse of learning strengthens it. Number 6, teachers need to look for any errors and omissions in student learning, and so that they can correct these. If you get detailed insights into what students do and don't understand, you can reteach and you can correct misconceptions. This needs to be as immediate as possible. So, how many of these principles are satisfied by students writing their own notes? Pause the video while you think this through. Well, you could make a strong case for all the principles in red being met by student note making. But hardly any of these principles are met by giving students notes written by the teacher. Then students don't have to listen. They don't have to think hard. They don't have to connect ideas to prior learning to make sense of them. And they don't get their learning checked and corrected. Evidence-based teaching continually shows us that conventional practice is not best practice. Oddly, this is good news. We know how to improve.